Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Trevor. I'm the Communications Manager for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, which is the latest in the spring leg of the 2025 webinar series. If you are new to our webinar, a little background on our group. CCSN works to connect patients, survivors, and other stakeholder groups with decision makers and the wider community to engage in discussion and to act on evidence-based best practices to alleviate the medical, emotional, financial, and social costs of cancer. To learn more, visit survivornet.ca. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and a link will be provided by the email you registered with, along with a link to the slides provided with this presentation. We will have a quick Q&A session at the end, but if you would like, put in your questions in the chat at the end, should be in the GoToWebinar tab. And now to present our presenter, Leonard Angka has a master's in pharmaceutical science from the University of Waterloo and received his PhD in cancer immunology under the supervision of Dr. Rebecca Auer at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute in 2021. He coordinated the successful submission of the 2023 Canadian Cancer Society Breakthrough Team Grant application, which would ultimately lead to the creation of the C3 organization. Leonard is now the project manager for the C3 program and helps with launching the various C3 initiatives. And so I'm going to hand it over to Leonard Angka for his talk, Collaborative Advocacy in Healthcare Technology Assessment.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Trevor, for inviting me to give this presentation. It's been a long journey and a lot of learning took place as we got towards the pemigatinib. I mean, we're still in the pemigatinib advocacy story, but we're a lot further along from where we began. So really excited to present. Thank you again, Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, for giving me the opportunity. And yeah, let's get into it. So I have no conflicts to disclose. And an overview of the talk. So I'll first give a background about cholangiocarcinoma. I'll talk about the Canadian Cholangiocarcinoma Collaborative, or the C3, and also the challenges of accessing drugs in Canada for cholangiocarcinoma. Then I'll go on into info about pemigatinib, the history of this drug's approval, access, and advocacy in Canada, and then some of the next steps and things we're looking forward to. And I'll end this talk with lessons learned about collaborative advocacy and some concluding thoughts. And so I first wanted to just frame the discussion and give some background information about the cancer that we are working with and trying to advocate for. So this cancer starts in the biliary system, and the liver, it produces this yellow fluid called bile, and bile is a fluid that helps digest fat. So it breaks down larger fat globules into smaller pieces so that you can easily digest it. This bile travels through the liver ducts and can get stored within the gallbladder. But when it's needed, it'll travel to the small intestine to help digest the fat. So biliary tract cancers are cancers that originate from any part of the biliary system. And this includes cholangiocarcinoma, so coming from the bile ducts, or from the gallbladder. You can see here that it's further broken down into different subtypes. So it could be intrahepatic, so coming from the bile ducts within the liver. 30% of cholangiocarcinomas are intrahepatic. Or it could also be extrahepatic, so the parts of the bile duct that are outside of the liver, and that's the remaining 70%. It's a very rare cancer. Less than 1,000 Canadians are diagnosed with this per year, so that accounts for about 1% of all cancer diagnoses. And it's also very difficult to diagnose, typically caught at later stages. These are some of the common symptoms, signs, and risk factors. So since it's related to the liver, there's jaundice as one of the main symptoms, so yellowing of the skin and the eyes. You might have dark urine, clay-colored stool, abdominal pain, itchy skin, weight loss, nausea, vomiting, or fever. The risk factors are generally associated with liver ailments. So there is a parasite that is more common in East Asia. They're known as liver flukes, and they cause a lot of inflammation in the liver. Primary sclerosing cholangitis is also a risk factor, and other chronic liver diseases such as fatty liver disease, which is now termed metabolic dysfunction associated steatotic liver disease. In terms of diagnosis, usually you would go and get a blood test, and they look for elevated cancer markers. So these could be your CEA or your CA19-9. So if these markers are higher than normal ranges, then that is used in the diagnosis procedure. Can also be diagnosed through medical imaging, MRIs, ultrasounds, or CT scans, or having laboratory tests done for liver function and physical exams. So again, cholangiocarcinoma is rare and one of the most deadly cancers. There's a median overall survival of less than 12 months if you're diagnosed with this. The 5-year survival rates for stage 1, when the cancer is still localized, is higher, it's 20%. But if the cancer is metastasized and you present as stage 4, those 5-year survival rates plummet quite drastically to 2%. Surgery is sometimes an option. So usually if caught early enough and you can have surgery, 30 to 40%, this might be an option. But generally, patients are given a standard of care regimen consisting of a chemotherapy combination and immunotherapy. So they would be given gemcitabine and cisplatin combined with immunotherapy durvalumab. But there are still other options, and these are within the research space. So certain clinical trials or targeted therapies can be an option if you have cholangiocarcinoma. This is because cholangiocarcinoma is actually a very mutated cancer. It has many targetable mutations, and you can see here that for intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, more than 45% of the tumors might have a mutation that you can target with a therapy or a drug. And this is 20% for extrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas. Some of the most common mutations include IDH1, SGFR2, which we'll talk a lot about later, MDM amplifications, and more. And I just wanted to make this point that it's already a rare cancer. Less than 1,000 people are diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma a year. But when you break it down into the subtypes for the specific mutations, it becomes almost an ultra rare cancer. In some cases, there might only be 10 people diagnosed with this specific mutation for cholangiocarcinoma. And that really makes advocating and getting access to therapies very difficult for this type of cancer. So there are lots of targets, and there are actually a lot of therapies available, but there are just not many available in Canada. And so compared to the States, Canada falls far behind in the number of targeted therapies and approved and funded drugs for cholangiocarcinoma. This is a table of some of the more common mutations found in cholangiocarcinoma. It shows the frequency of mutations and also shows what molecular therapies are available. If it has a flag, that means that it's approved or recommended by the guidelines in the States. So a lot of these are approved or recommended. But when you look at the ones that are approved and recommended in Canada, there's only 2 of them really. So these are some of the problems that we face when trying to advocate for this cancer. There are fewer clinical trials in Canada compared to the States, and there's a lot of barriers to molecular testing. So that's the background on cholangiocarcinoma and some of the challenges that we face. And now I just want to introduce what the Canadian Cholangiocarcinoma Collaborative is. So we are a grant-funded network. We are funded by the Canadian Cancer Society and Canadian Institutes of Health Research. We were funded in 2023, and the title of our program is Building a National Network to Drive Research Discoveries and Expand Access to Immunotherapies for People with Biliary Tract Cancers. The work and the main institute that this grant operates out of is the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and we organize everything within the collaborative. So as I said, it's a research network. So we have principal investigators and researchers from across Canada. These are the institutes that we partnered with for the creation of the grant, but we are hoping to expand the number of partners that we have to really cover all of Canada. But these institutes include the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, CHUM, which is Centre Hospitalier de University of Montreal, the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research, BC Cancer Research, UHN Princess Margaret's Cancer Centre, and McGill University. Quick overview of the main pillars of the C3. We broke it down into 3 different aims. And so the first aim is called C3 Hope. This is led by Dr. Rebecca Auer from the Ottawa Hospital. And through this aim, we want to provide comprehensive patient and caregiver support. And we also want to integrate patients early on into research opportunities and research discussions. The second aim is led by Dr. Simon Turcotte from CHUM in Montreal. And this is developing a clinical trial using tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, or TIL therapy. And it'll be a phase 1 clinical trial and the first of its kind, being an investigator-initiated trial in Canada. And then the last aim is our C3 Impact, and this is all about fueling a research pipeline to generate novel discoveries. And we do this by collaborating across Canada, sharing resources, sharing samples, sharing data. There are 5 main C3 research projects, and the lead for this is Dr. Leonard Angka, and she's also from the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. So since our inception, we've been really focusing on growing our network of healthcare professionals who treat biliary tract cancers. And so these include oncologists, surgeons, pathologists, and more. We have 150 or more medical experts on our mailing list. We do physician newsletters, we have medical education, webinars and things like that. We also have a C3 referral pamphlet for physicians to hand out to patients if they are newly diagnosed in the clinic. This just gives them information about the C3 and sort of a starting point and info on how to get in contact with us. And then we also engage them about advocacy efforts. We also have a growing Canadian cholangiocarcinoma community. Our Facebook group has probably more than 150 members now, but it's really organically grown. It's where patients can discuss and ask questions. Really it's supposed to be just a place for organic discussion and people to find other people who are going through similar circumstances. We've been trying to intentionally build this. We do this through local meetups, different events. We have webinars that are patient focused, educational as well. We also have monthly support groups, and we run a monthly advocacy group. And this is in collaboration with other cholangiocarcinoma patient groups too. So the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation in the States, and also Cholangiohepatocellular Carcinoma Canada, or CHCC. So this is just a slide about some of the main C3 programs and initiatives that fall under that C3 Hope pillar, providing comprehensive patient support and access to research. So the first program that we offer is a research navigator, and she is a dedicated staff member. Her role is to interact and help patients along their figure out what the next steps are, provide resources, Canadian specific ones, and also just be there to to get their questions or hear their experiences too. We do biliary tract cancer multidisciplinary rounds, and these are monthly tumor boards that are virtual across Canada. These are for physicians, and patient cases are presented, and the summary from those discussions are given to the treating physician so that they can make a more informed decision about the care. I mentioned our monthly virtual support groups. We are also developing a C3 registry, and this will help just gather that data from the cholangiocarcinoma patients in Canada, and hopefully use that to towards our advocacy efforts. We have a HOPE research study, which measures hopes and outcomes. And we also try to improve access to clinical trials by engaging with different industry companies or pharma companies to get them to come to Canada and bring their novel drugs and start clinical trials here. These last 2 points is what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this session, our molecular testing program and our advocacy efforts. And so we have a program where we're trying to improve access to molecular testing, and we're doing this through education, coordination, and funding. And we also do a lot of advocacy. We have monthly advocacy meetings co-hosted by the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation and CHCC, and we try to just coordinate efforts. So more about molecular testing. It's also known as biomarker testing, and it's a test that's used to identify what mutations your tumor might have. And so in the case of cholangiocarcinoma, for example, FGFR2 fusions, molecular testing would be able to tell you if you have this mutation or not. It is strongly recommended for biliary tract cancers. In 2023, there was a paper published by leading Canadian oncologists about how we should treat biliary tract cancers in Canada. And one of the main recommendations was to do molecular testing. Unfortunately, it is still not part of the standard of care process, and molecular testing is not covered by our governments. There's a lot of excuses when it comes to why it's not covered or why there are no drugs. It's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario. So on the one hand, for molecular testing, the excuse is, why would we fund testing if there's no access to targeted drugs? Like, why know what you have if you can't even access the drugs? And then on the targeted drug side, why should we fund these targeted drugs if there's no way of knowing what mutations exist in the population? And so this conundrum is very frustrating, but this was something that we really wanted to address as the C3. And this is just a quote from Dr. Auer from a recent press release about our molecular testing program. It says that by increasing access to molecular testing, we hope to increase treatment options for people with this rare cancer. And that's really the heart and the passion behind it. We don't know what we should advocate for if we don't know what there is out there. And so this is the molecular testing landscape in Canada as it is right now. So I'm happy to say that for all Canadians with biliary tract cancer, you should be able to access molecular testing for your cancer. So if you reside in Quebec, Quebec is actually, they provincially fund molecular testing through the McGill University Health Centre and OptiLab. But if you live in Ontario and the rest of Canada, the C3, we launched a program where we fund testing through these 2 different partners. So in Ontario, part of the testing is already covered. So they will cover FGFR testing if you are an Ontario patient. But we have expanded that test to also include 11 additional targets that are relevant to biliary tract cancers. And this is in collaboration with UHN Genome Diagnostic Labs. For the rest of Canada, they have, well, we've partnered with OncoHelix Labs to fund their 170 gene comprehensive genomic panel. Previously, this was a program that was run and funded by Incyte, the makers of pemigatinib, but they've ended their testing program and we've sort of taken it on. So yeah, you can find out more at our website, www.cholangio.ca/getmoleculartesting. So I go back to this slide because I just want to note that there, again, are a lot of targets and therapies, and there's a lot of hope in these options, but again, just not many for Canada. And so the rest of the talk will talk about what we've done in terms of advocacy for pemigatinib and getting this drug to patients who have, getting it funded for patients that have biliary tract cancer and the FGFR fusion mutation. So a little bit about pemigatinib. It is a drug that's made by Incyte, and it works by inhibiting FGFR2 signaling. So FGFR2 is fibroblast growth factor receptor 2. These are receptors that are found on your cells, and they basically control cell growth and replication. This is a very simplified version of what's happening molecularly, but I think it does well for this talk. So normally, FGFR2 would need another molecule to bind the receptor. It would need fibroblast growth factor to bind to FGFR2. And when it binds, then the normal cell will go through a very controlled growth and replication cycle. Now, if your tumor has the FGFR2 fusion, this is when it becomes cancerous, because now your cells, they don't need this, this other molecule to grow. And so it has a continuous signal, and it's basically always on, and there's uncontrolled growth and replication. So pemigatinib prevents this uncontrolled growth by stopping the signaling. So essentially, it turns that signaling off in the cancer cells. 10% of all intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas are positive for this mutation. And importantly, you do need a specific type of molecular testing to detect the fusions. There's a lot of different companies who provide molecular testing, but not all of them have that partner agnostic testing that's needed to detect these fusions at a high degree of certainty. The options that I mentioned a couple slides ago, we do provide that, the correct test to detect it. So pemigatinib is a oral pill. It's taken, so one cycle is 21 days, and it's taken daily for 14 days, and then you have a 7-day break. The average, well, the cost of one cycle is about $11,000, and the 28-day average is about $15,000. And so this comes to almost 200,000 or more than 200,000 per year if you were to take this drug or pay for it out of pocket. It was approved by Health Canada, and it was approved for unresectable, locally advanced, or metastatic cholangiocarcinoma with this particular fusion, the FGFR2 fusion. And it's also been approved in other parts of the world, such as the US, European Union, Japan, and Australia. And this is approved for funding, so it's covered. This slide just goes through the process of what needs to take place in order for a drug to be paid for by the government. And so it starts with the drug company having a new drug, so pemigatinib in this case. They would then apply for its authorization and use in Canada. So they would submit their scientific evidence package to Health Canada, and this is really based on just, is it safe and is it effective? The next step is, if it does get approved for its use, then the company can start giving it to Canadians. And there's different ways that Canadians can get this drug. The simplest are either the person pays out of pocket, but as mentioned, it's 200,000 a year, so that's really not an option for most Canadians. Or if you have a very good private drug plan and insurance. The third option is trying to get it covered. And in order for a drug to be covered and added to the public formulary, it has to go through 3 different steps. So the first is with the Health Technology Assessment Agencies, or HTA. And these HTAs, they conduct a review based on almost a cost effectiveness standard. And so they'll look at all of the evidence again and now see if it's more cost effective than whatever is already out there. In Canada, there are 2 HTAs. So in Quebec, there's INES. And for the rest of Canada, there's Canada's Drug Agency, which was previously known as CADA. So at this stage, the drug, if it gets a positive recommendation for funding, then it'll go towards the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, where the provinces negotiate with the drug makers on a price and the criteria for covering it. So yeah, essentially the provinces, they want to, they don't want to pay that 200,000 per year or whatever the cost of the drug is, and so they'll negotiate since there's more volume, and usually it does bring the price down considerably. And then lastly, it goes to the public drug plans if there is an agreed upon price, and then that's where the provinces will decide to whether or not to list it on their formularies. So now I'm just going to go through a timeline of the history of the reviews and approvals for pemigatinib in Canada. So started in September 2021, pemigatinib got Health Canada approval for its use in cholangiocarcinoma. And shortly after that, I assume that the company then submitted a package to the HTAs to get a recommendation for funding. In April 2022, the issue was sent that CADITH and INES did not recommend this for funding. So this was a first rejection. After this point, there was a lot of, I guess, anger, or people were not pleased about this ruling. So they asked for a reevaluation, and this reevaluation was requested to look at it through a rare disease lens, and this was in May 2022. Unfortunately, shortly after, in June 2022, CADITH upheld their initial recommendation of not funding it for Canada. The main reasons why was, one, because there was a lack of a natural history control arm in the evidence that was submitted. And so this meant that they were just unsure if the people that had the FGFR2 fusion just in general had a longer life expectancy compared to those that do not have this fusion. So not sure of the actual effect the drug was having, because in the evidence that was submitted, they did not have that natural history control arm. This data is actually it was very difficult to obtain and maybe impossible, because at the time in 2021, molecular testing was not common and people weren't getting tested for their cancer. So getting that cohort of patients who did not have this fusion back in 2021 was very difficult. Another factor was that these HTAs, they weigh the data that comes from Canadian clinical trials a lot more than any data that comes from international trials. And so just Canada, we just didn't have that much data. And it's the struggle that we have, since it's such a rare cancer. Okay, so then comes 2023, and in 2023 there were two there were two Canadian cholangiocarcinoma specific groups that were formed. So the first was, or maybe not the first, but the Canadian Cholangiocarcinoma Collaborative, cholangio.ca, and also Cholangiohepatocellular Carcinoma Canada. These are two different groups, but we collaborated a lot, and we really gave a voice to the patients, clinicians, and researchers who were advocating for this. So I'll be quite honest, during that first 2023, during the first year of 2023, excuse me, my dog is barking. But anyways, in 2023, I myself was still getting up to speed with the different issues and barriers that cholangiocarcinoma patients were facing. So we didn't really have much say or much input on this next phase. But we heard that INES gave a positive recommendation for funding in November 2023. And I remember INES was that Quebec health technology assessment firm. And so this was a huge win, and it really spurred a lot more. It really spurred a lot more advocacy and effort. So this was a letter that was written by the Canadian GI Oncology Evidence Network in November 2023, after that positive recommendation. And it does state here that because INES reconsidered their funding for pemigatinib, they issued positive recommendation for funding. We want the CDA and CADITH to do the same. So this was a letter by 12 physicians that were signed on. And yeah, it really started, the advocacy efforts really started to become more vocal. From then, this is when I started to get more involved with the advocacy. And I should also mention this was really my first venture into advocating for anything. But I helped organize these advocacy efforts through different letter writing campaigns. We tried to coordinate a lot of public media interviews and articles. And we also had meetings with Health Canada and the CDA. There were petitions, and we tried to amplify clinician quotes and a lot of Twitter activity. Here are just some examples of some of the letters written by physicians within our network. So this is from March 19, 2024, from Arndt Vogel. We also had support from different members of Parliament. So from Aislinn Clancy and Kitchener, they were very vocal about this issue, and they were huge proponents for cholangiocarcinoma patients in Canada. From May to June, we had a more organized letter advocacy campaign. So I drafted a template letter that was going to be sent out to physicians and patients within our C3 network and also the CHCC network. It was initially focused on hitting the federal level, so getting Minister Mark Holland's attention and requesting that they almost demand a reevaluation by CADITH for pemigatinib. In addition, we also offered some solutions in the way of obtaining real-world data through our C3 registry. This was the ask. So we were asking people to write letters to their local or their federal MPs to join us in our request to reevaluate the CADITH recommendation, particularly using it again in a rare disease unmet need lens. And then if they require more data, we could give that through the C3 registry. We were asking any patients to connect with the C3 so that we can give them this template, and if they were willing to to email it to their MPs. In total, we had 25 patients, physicians, and researchers who submitted letters to their MPs using this template. Here are just some more examples. So this one's from Dr. Auer to Mr. Holland on May 30. This one is from Mike Morris, MP for Kitchener, and he actually spoke at House of Commons about this issue too. And this is a letter from myself to my local MP at the time. I'm sorry if you can hear some banging. There's unfortunate timing with some renovations in the house. Anyways, so we continued our advocacy, and these are just more examples. We were trying to organize a lot of media coverage. A lot of this happened without my knowledge or input, but we helped amplify it and share it widely. So there were articles from Alberta in March, from Ontario. There's 3 different ones. This is also a screenshot of Mike Morris. At the House of Commons giving his requests. And then also in BC, all of these related to getting coverage for pemigatinib in Canada. And then in June 13, 2024, we heard that Alberta decided to cover the cost of pemigatinib. And this was a real milestone because this was before we even got this was before there was a resubmission. This was still while the CDA had their non-recommendation for funding. And so this was just an example of how the provinces don't always have to follow the recommendations by these health technology assessments. So yeah, this was a huge win. And at this time, it was so exciting. There was almost news coming out every week. So yeah. This was a petition that was started by a caregiver, and it was on change.org, and the petition was to make pemigatinib available in Ontario and across Canada. I just checked today, we're at 9,779 signatures, and really want to get to that 10,000. So if you can, please go and sign the petition if you haven't already. These are just some examples of physician quotes that we collected during the period of time, and then some of the tweets. So it really just shows that there was a lot of different voices. There was patients, clinicians, there was members of parliament. We had industry help. We had different patient or advocacy groups also joining in on these efforts, and it really just showed that we were persistent and made a lot of noise. After all of that flurry of advocacy and letter writing, in August 2024, we finally started getting responses to our advocacy letters. This first one, and this one came from the Ontario MP, and they indicated to us that they wanted us to they wanted the company Insight to resubmit another package and evidence to reevaluate pemigatinib. And this was really just the first instance where we got a signal from them that that maybe we should put something together. This is the letter response that we got from Patrick Discerny, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister. And then in this red box here, basically says that manufacturer can file a resubmission to Canada Drug Agency. And interestingly, he cited another publication, and this publication was not a Canadian study, but it was a study from I think 2 cohorts, one from France and one from Italy, but gave indication that maybe they were interested in hearing in looking at the data from other parts of the world, so that since we didn't have that natural history data and evidence for pemigatinib in Canada. In response to that letter, we started a joint advocacy letter, and this was signed on by 9 patient advocacy groups. So the C3, CHCC, the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, Colorectal Cancer Resource and Action Network, or CRAN, the Save Your Skin Foundation, the CCSN, Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. We also had the Canadian GI Oncology Evidence Network and the Canadian Organization for Rare Diseases and Cancer Immunology. And so not all of these were patient advocacy groups that didn't focus on cholangiocarcinoma, but it was really great to see other advocacy groups, join our vision and contribute to the cause and the fight. So we sent this letter to, the first one was addressed to Minister Sylvia Jones from Ontario. And then subsequently, Brenda from CHCC, she adapted the letter and sent it out to all the other provinces and the health ministers. This was the letter that we sent out. You can see that over the course of time, we also learned that having a nicely formatted letter might actually make a difference. Really touching on putting patient faces to the letter also, we thought would improve just the acceptance of it and show that it is real people that are affected by their indecision. And so we included that in this letter too. All right. So that was September 2024, our joint patient group advocacy letter. And then in October 2024, we heard from the manufacturer, from Insight, that they were going to go ahead and resubmit the data and the evidence to the CDA and CADTH for another reevaluation. Involved in this process were the patient feedback submission and also the clinician feedback submission. And this was a huge amount of work. And I really have to applaud Brenda from CHCC, who led this effort, and also thank CCRAN for giving us advice on how to go about putting together a patient feedback submission. So from October to December, we found people that had experience with pemigatinib. So if either they were on the drug for a certain period of time or they're still on it. And Brenda conducted 60-minute to 120-minute interviews with these patients from across Canada. In total, we had 12 patients. There were 6 from Ontario, 4 from Alberta, and 2 from British Columbia. 9 out of the 12 patients had experience with pemigatinib, but all of them had an FGFR fusion. So in total, this was a 33-page document. It was very well written, very well communicated, just the experiences from the patient lens. On the clinician side, Bob Bick from Cancer Immunology and myself, we helped organize getting physicians together to sign on to the feedback submission. And so this was again headed by the Canadian Gastrointestinal Oncology Evidence Network, and Dr. Vincent Tam from Alberta authored and submitted this. This time we had 17 clinicians. So we had more clinicians in the first submission. And in addition, we had letters from the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. And also there was one individual letter from a medical oncologist. All of these documents can be found on the CDA website. And I put links on this PowerPoint on how you can get that too. So this is sort of where we're at right now. On the CDA's website, you can see if you go there that for pemigatinib, the project is active. There's a reimbursement review ongoing for cholangiocarcinoma. Some of the key dates were the call for the patient clinician input was closed. We submitted it in advance of that date. I heard from Insight that CADIS had already provided some feedback about the initial documents. There was nothing really concerning, so that was very straightforward. And then they also replied to those comments. So according to their timeline, apparently yesterday is when the expert review committee for the health technology assessment for CADIS, that's when they would have met on March 12th. I haven't heard any news about if that meeting happened or how it went, but I'm hoping that it went well. And what we're looking forward to next is the draft recommendation letter. So that'll be given to Insight sometime between March 25th, so end of this month. And then the different stakeholders, so the patients, clinicians will get the recommendation by April 3rd. This will all come to a head on April 17th with the final decision. Okay, so lessons learned about this whole process and collaborative advocacy. I put this little cartoon just to lighten the mood, but here it says, individually, I'm weak, united, we are strong. And then you have this giant monster that says, I love when they get together like that. It makes squishing more convenient. But truly, I believe that when we are united together, the stronger our voice becomes. Yes, it might be easier to squish it, but one of the main struggles that we had was really getting the attention of anyone. So if it makes it easier to squish, then maybe it makes it easier to also move along the advocacy progress, or yeah. Here are some of the main points. I learned that it's really important to gather all of the stakeholders. So this included the patients, caregivers, the healthcare professionals, different patient advocacy groups, the pharmaceutical companies. We also had meetings with the health technology assessment agencies and also members of parliament. Yeah, so gathering all the stakeholders was very important. Having a shared vision and a very clear one, I think was really important. Coming together so that we all have the same message, I think helped with, getting that message seen and heard. For number 3 here, defining the roles. I took a leadership role in terms of organizing the letters and just getting the meetings together with the different groups. I think that having someone like that involved in the process helps with just, making sure that things get done. And that also relates to having a plan of action. We communicated very frequently. So as I mentioned, we had monthly advocacy meetings with the Canadian cholangiocarcinoma advocates. But even beyond that, there were so many emails and so many group calls during this time. Lastly, we were also always willing to adjust and adapt our strategy, whether that be trying to get the ear of the federal government or different provincial governments. Yeah, so just being flexible and adaptable is very important too. Okay, so some last concluding thoughts. The fight isn't over, and I don't know if it will ever be over. Advocacy takes on many forms. There's an unending list of issues and barriers that we face just for cholangiocarcinoma alone. But I think that by just committing to it and having that network and that organization, really helps. I think that now we need to start thinking bigger because pemigatinib was just one part of the barriers and the struggles that this rare cancer faces in Canada. So how will we actually get to the root cause? Because we can't do this for every drug that wants to get funded in Canada. We need to think bigger. We need to think creatively. We need to work with each other. And thirdly, we need to rely on each other. I myself could not have done this alone. And I think that this presentation really speaks to all of the different hands and people who played a role in this. And so that's the end of my talk. I wanted to dedicate it to the many people and advocates who were really instrumental in making this possible and in fighting for access for pemigatinib. Here are some of the names and faces. Unfortunately, they've passed away, but we continue to fight for them and we continue to remember them. You can support the C3. We recently made it possible to support the C3 by donations to the Canadian Cancer Society. Our vision is to build a hopeful future, and we believe that by continuing what we're doing here through donations and through funding, we can do that. And so all of the donations will go towards sustaining our patient support programs and our research programs, including the molecular testing and the national registry. So you can do that by going to www.cancer.ca/supportc3. And lastly, these are just my acknowledgements. C3 is a much larger team, different groups, different people. Really big shout out to the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation and also the Cholangiohepatocellular Carcinoma Canada group and our funders and industry sponsors. If you want to get in contact with me or find out more about cholangio, we have a website, cholangio.ca. This is our email. We have a Twitter, Instagram, and a Facebook group. And so I'll end there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leonard. That was a fantastic discussion, and I have been privileged to a little bit of this journey that you have gone on, and I've got to say it's been quite a journey with this so far, and it continues the journey into the future. We have a couple of questions. One, how significant is having a registry? If significant, how did you start?
It's a great question. And to answer this, I would say that we don't know how significant it will be because our registry is still getting up and running. We have already like the framework of it, but we haven't started collecting the data from the medical records, and we haven't started looking through the data to see what comes out of it. In theory, though, we do think that this will be a huge part in contributing to advocacy efforts because we could, for example, use it to understand the mutational burden in the Canadian cholangiocarcinoma population. So we could use that to attract different clinical trials to start in Canada. Or different drug companies to come to Canada because they would see that there's actually a large proportion of patients that need it. Another aspect of it would be for this real world evidence generation. So we suggested that these health technology assessment agencies could take advantage of our registry because we would be collecting that data on outcomes, and this would be on outcomes for patients that have gotten a drug that was outside of a clinical trial, so through a compassionate support program or access program. So this data is really important. It shows what the general population would like their outcomes on a drug, but right now there's no way of capturing that. So a registry that's national, that is what we call fit for purpose, would actually go a long way in that discussion.
Mm-hmm. And who owns this registry that is talking? Is it in your group in-house or is it owned by another entity?
Yeah, so it would be owned, well, the data would be held by the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, since that's where the C3 is, we operate out of. So the Ottawa Hospital, we have the firewalls and all the security. So that's currently where it would be held and owned.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Can pemigatinib be used for extrahepatic as it is to be deemed for intrahepatic? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing those words, but yeah.
No worries. Yeah. So off the top of my head, I don't want to give you the wrong information, so I am not sure. I believe that intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas, like the mutation itself, FGFR2 fusions, occurs more so in the intrahepatic subtype. Um, but if you do have FGFR fusion in extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, yeah, you might be able to. I would say look at the Insight website or the drug description. It should say in there.
Hmm. Another question about the registry, actually, and this is the final one before we have to close it off for today. How is the registry funded?
So right now, the C3 is grant funded. We were funded to do all of those different programs and also the clinical trial and the research sub projects. So the funding right now would come through the initial grant funds that we received from the Canadian Cancer Society and CIHR. But I mentioned about how you could support C3. So once, like, our grant is a 5-year grant, but we'll probably get an extension, hopefully. But in addition to that, any donations that come towards the Canadian Cancer Society will go towards continuing these more patient support focused initiatives that we have, including the registry. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, Leonard. It was a fantastic conversation, and I wish you well on your continued work with pemigatinib, and hopefully it will get to the patients who need it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Now, this is one in a series of webinars that we are presenting this spring. Our next one is going to be happening in a couple of weeks, so stay in the loop about webinars by subscribing to our newsletter. If you're not seeing the newsletter in your inbox, check your spam folder because we do use a third-party email service. Make sure that you are subscribed by going to our website to not miss just the webinars, but anything that we do here at CCSN. All webinars can be found at survivornet.ca/webinar or on CCSN YouTube channel. And with that, I wish everyone a fantastic day, and we'll see you on the next one.